A couple of months ago, I was interviewing a British writer. It had to, at the point, it had to do with history. I like this argument on ancient history because it is very important. It helps us to understand even what is happening today. Say maybe in the United States, many people they think that when we are looking at the United States, maybe the treatment of African America and the white America, it just start and end in the United States. I usually say no, it doesn't start and end there. We need to go beyond these people. Who are these African Americans and who are these white America? Where are they coming from? Then at the point we get to understand that these are even neighbors. Before there was the United States, there was Africa, and there was Europe. They are neighbors. So we should be able to take it there and even further than that to understand where we are coming from. So in this sense, history is very important. So the digging up of history also is very costly and very and require a lot of work. For this, even by mere rational thinking, it is going to be impossible for a line that was established for you to go against. By that I mean, if Washington is sponsoring an expedition to Africa to study African history, Africans should count themselves out that they are going to be represented in that story. It is not possible because they are not the one footing the bill. It is hard to do. It is not just I'm going there to tell the history of the world. No, there are sentiments, there are feelings, there are questions that are very pertinent to more important thing than just writing. It is not, because like you also said, somebody is going to approve it. Approve it based on what? So if Abuja, which is the Nigeria government, were the one spearheading an expedition, the verification, the parameter they are going to use to evaluate what they found is going to be different from what Washington is going to need. Because what Nigeria is going to ask for is not what Washington is going to ask for. For this same reason, I think Africans need to be the one that is digging up their own story. They need to tell their story. They need to pay the cost for it. They need to interpret it according to their sense and sensibility. Now, going back to this again, because you work on this a lot, of course, before the interview, we have exchanged few lines on that. Can you share anything with me in terms of your reference about this Egyptology study, what you find, how you gather your evidence? Because now I want to state what is already obvious, that by talking about Egypt, we are talking about Africa. Normally, Africans should have been the expert in this story. But do we have them there? Because most of Egyptologists are not actually Africans.
Well, there are a lot of Egyptians who are Egyptologists. So Africa is well represented in terms of Egyptian Egyptologists. There are also many Sudanese people who are Nubiologists and also Egyptologists. So let's say the Nile Valley part of Africa is represented in the disciplines of Egyptology and Nubiology. Elsewhere in Africa, there are fewer Egyptologists and Nubiologists represented. I wouldn't say there aren't any, but fewer, at least to my knowledge. I have only met, I would say, less than 10 people. And maybe there are more, and I just haven't had the opportunity to meet them. That's quite possible, because I know there are university programs in Africa that treat these Nile Valley cultures. I haven't been to any of those universities, so I haven't met any of those people. But I'll give you a couple of names. I mean, Theophile Benga is one person who spent much of his career in the United States teaching and is now back in Africa. And he, to my knowledge, has started a program in ancient Nile Valley cultures. One very famous person who is no longer with us is Sheikh Anta Diop, of course. So there's a strong tradition of this. And there are certain people I know. Yoporeka Somet is one person who I've never met in person, but I've exchanged some emails with him, who is not from the Nile Valley, but is working on these ancient cultures. And so there may be so many more others that I don't know and would love to meet, because I would love to hear about their work.
Actually, That is very important. Yeah, of course, there are many African scholars out there in this area. I'm only looking at the percentage compared to what we often read about as Egyptologists, as part of Egyptian history. In most of the cases, even in documentary, are usually the Europeans. Maybe this is part of the fact that okay, there is a project, they need to be approved, they need to okay, it's evidence now. We can go out there and we can just see them. Okay, now let's say in your field of study, because this is your field of study, when you go out to present a case from your finding, what kind of exchange do you easily meet? Is it a kind of resistance on the part of the African people? Is it an accept? Tell me about your feeling with the people. What do you usually experience when you go to talk about Egyptian history, and maybe the audience are Africans, things like that?
So I haven't had the opportunity to speak in Africa about my research. I've done a lot of speaking in the U.S. And so I can talk to you about the reception to my work in the US, if you like. So the last, gosh, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, I've been working on this project that I mentioned to you, where I'm looking at scholars of African descent in the US in the early 20th century and conversations they were having with Egyptologists or about Egyptology in general. And the reception I've gotten in the US is very positive because no one knew about these conversations before I started doing, well, let's say very few people knew about these conversations when I started doing this research. So Egyptologists for sure had no idea. This was not part of the history of the discipline that we learn. So Egyptologists are very excited. They had no idea that, for instance, Flinders Petrie, who's a very famous British archaeologist, was writing letters with W.E.B. Du Bois, or that Marcus and Amy Jakes Garvey were writing editorials that were talking about the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, or were criticizing the professor of Egyptology at Harvard. Nobody knew that Booker T. Washington was exchanging letters with a professor of Egyptology at the University of Chicago. Pauline Hopkins, who is a woman who's an African-American novelist and editor. Nobody knew that she wrote a novel set in the Nile Valley and used all of these history books to construct the conversations that the archaeologists had about the work that they were doing there. So there's some really exciting stuff that I found. And Egyptologists are excited about it. And members of the public, when I give talks, are very excited about it, because this is new information. These are connections between these university professors, between the history books that they wrote, and African descended communities in the US.
That's very interesting. All right, now as an Egyptologist, when you get to your site, okay, I know might be depending on what kind of project you are working on, but actually I'm interested in what are you actually looking for? I mean, when you go to dig, what are you looking for? What tells you that this is a valid thing and the other is not a valid thing, for example?
So let me begin by saying I've never excavated in Egypt. So like I was saying early in our talk, when I was young, when I was doing my archaeological training, you couldn't do that training in Egypt. So I actually did my training elsewhere, both in the United States and in Jordan. So what I'm going to tell you is not based on my experience excavating in Egypt, since I've never done that. But archaeologically speaking, everything you find is of value. The hardest thing I would say when you're excavating, and this doesn't hold true in Egypt just because the terrain is very different there, but where I was excavating, you come across a lot of rocks. And the importance is understanding, is this a rock that just happens to be here, or is this a rock that is part of a bigger structure? And if I sort of take this rock and toss it over my shoulder and throw it away, am I dismantling a structure? Or is this just a rock that doesn't matter and I can toss it away and be done with it? So that's kind of a simplistic example of the choices you have to make when you're excavating.